phones on silent and shut your fucking mouth. The show is about to begin.
Well, thank you for that introduction, Olivia. That, of course, is Liv Cowherd, a TikTok I found where she was roasting her father, Colin Cowherd. I find her to be very humorous, but it's a little, her most for humor's a little on the younger side for me. But anyway, I thought it would be a good introduction to the show. We're back with episode 27. Bet Like No One's Watching joins the 27 club. I hope we live longer than the other 27-year-olds. This, of course, is Bet Like No One's Watching, a fantasy sports betting lifestyle podcast hosted by myself, John Sullivan. And I'm trying to do this once a month now, and we're in June, and today's podcast, we're at the state of almost sports returning. Just a quick rundown. We've got NASCAR back. As a matter of fact, there's a race today in Atlanta. We have Aussie Rules football starting on Thursday morning. Or should I say Friday morning, Thursday night. We have the NHL returning to play sometime in July. We have the NBA returning to play sometime in August. And we have the NFL planning on starting as scheduled with the regular season, and the CFL will also start, in September with an abbreviated season. And in baseball, the greedy bastards continue to argue over money. There's a proposed between 40 and 80 game season, and that's being less and less likely with every day that goes by. I think the baseball owners would be perfectly fine with canceling the season, in my opinion. Just move on to another year. They've canceled the season before during during the labor disagreement in 94. So it's sad to see, but it's a business first and foremost. No matter what people think, it's a business. So with all the other stuff going on in the world, I'm not really going to talk about any of that. But with the shit show that is 2020, the one thing that's happened is that sporting events are fundamentally changed forever. The fan experience going forward after all of these activities this year, events this year, the fan experience is going to be very different. Leagues are going to have to pivot to broadcast revenue for the majority of their income. And in my opinion, this is going to be much easier for the smaller venue sports like basketball and hockey. Their arenas were never that big to begin with. We're going to definitely have smaller arenas. There's the economic fallout of what's happened this year. Some of the colleges are not going to reopen, and if they do, a lot of them will have canceled their sports programs. Some, if not all. And now football, because, outside of the NFL is such a behemoth, the worldwide brand. The NBA is kind of a worldwide brand as well. But it'll survive without fan attendance. Although it's going to be extremely altered. You think about the Bills Mafia tailgates, they'll still tailgate even if there's no football at the stadium. But the fan day experience will be very different. The stadiums will be smaller, much more luxury suites, social distanced. But for college and CFL football, this is going to have tremendous impact. The atmosphere and the of the college game day experience. That's I mean, ESPN has a show called College Game Day. What is that going to be like? And people can't show up in throngs, and they can't sit in a stadium together. It's going to fundamentally change college football forever. And CFL relies on ticket revenue to survive in that league. I mean, you've got guys, the guys that make the minimum, they make like 90,000 Canadian a year, which is like $60,000 US. And they rely on selling those beers and those tickets to pay those players. They get almost nothing for TV revenue. It's a shame because it's a great game and a great sport. And, a lot of people would like to see football go away eventually. But, I would like to see these sports thrive. Things are going to change in the sporting world, and we're just going to have to get used to it. We've got, the Kentucky Derby is supposed to be in the fall now. They're talking about a Labor Day Indy 500. Who knows what's going to happen? But fundamental changes in sports. And now that sports are coming back, I'm going to talk about sports betting media today. Well, sports betting podcasts mostly. There's an article I want to talk about. So, of course, I'm going to mention Rufus and his podcast and a few others. But before I get to that, I want to talk about, very briefly, sports cards. I talked about that last episode. More specifically, Alex Ovechkin, who I thought was the greatest investment in sports cards. And his stuff is already starting to pop, even though, again, we're 3 to 4 years away from it reaching max value, depending on how long or how close he gets to the goal scored record. Obviously, the end of the season, he only lost about 10 games in this season because of the suspension of play. He's sitting at 706 goals right now. But I actually think that this interruption is good for him and resting his body. He obviously keeps himself in very good physical condition. I think it's going to help him down the road, whether it means resting him up for a cup run and getting another Stanley Cup, which would increase the value of his cards, or actually, resting him up for future seasons. He's going to need a couple of 40-goal seasons at least to make this happen. So I would like, they're talking about having a shortened season next year, starting it in January and doing, 50 games or something like that. So it obviously puts him behind the 8 ball there, but I've bought several cards that I relist them at 300 to 400% markup, 4 to 5 times what I paid for them. And some of them are selling. So either I caught, I timed it right, but I know people are like, well, that's too expensive, but it won't be in a couple of years, is what I'm telling you. So yeah, everybody likes to make a quick buck, but, think of it as a 36-month CD. And, I still say you buy that Rookie Showdown card, and you won't go wrong. You could probably still find that card for $3 on eBay or somewhere else. All right, enough of sports cards. I want to talk about sports bettors in the media. So I'm going to start with this article that I read this past month, and it's called Professional Bettors Now Carry the Responsible Gambling Torch. Already, just reading that title, I'm facepalming myself. This article is published on a website called OZY.com. And if you want to read the article, I retweeted it on my BL Now a pod Twitter account, which at BL Now Pod. Bet like no one's watching on my podcast page. So there's a link to the article there on my timeline, and you can read it. And the author interviews Rufus Peabody, Spanky, whose real name is Gudun Kirolos, and Captain Jack Andrews, who I have no idea what his real name is. But the one thing that all three of these bettors have in common is they all have podcasts. And that's about it. I think they're all very smart guys. I talked about Rufus before. And so the gist of the article is that Rufus, Spanky, and Captain Jack have all launched podcasts to educate bettors, as I'm doing the air quotes, educate bettors. And they also mentioned in the article the nonprofit coalition that Rufus and Captain Jack were trying to start, but Rufus said it's put on ice because of the current economic conditions, which I understand completely. You can't try to get people to donate to something when they can't afford food. So without rereading the article and getting my blood boiling, here's my take on each of their podcasts. We'll start with Rufus. Of course, Rufus and Jeff Ma host Bet the Process. I've talked about it before. I've talked about Rufus before. He's a smart guy, and he's trying to do well. He's obviously made a name for himself as a successful sports bettor, and he's trying to walk that tightrope between Seville and, the general public, and it's a very difficult tightrope to walk. I know this myself. So Rufus's podcast is very good, and if you can get past Jeff Ma constantly poking fun at Rufus's eccentricities / autism, he makes fun of Rufus getting excited about certain things or interrupting in certain ways, and it's like an old married couple kind of, but they talk a lot about math stuff, and they have guests, and my only complaint about this podcast is that they softball their guests. Whenever they have a guest on, never ask them any tough questions. Like Jeff talks about how he hosted a panel at Sloan and he asked the people tough questions, but they never do that on their own podcast. When they had Preston on, the Sports Cheetah, or they had Peter Jennings on, CSU Ram, they could have asked them a lot tougher questions than they did. Neither here nor there. I'm just nitpicking. They can do whatever they want. Their podcast is well followed, I think. It's probably one of the best sports betting podcasts. Now, Captain Jack is a smart guy. I've heard him on several podcasts. However, his content, which most of it is on YouTube, I find it to be very classic YouTube clickbaity stuff. He reminds me a lot of Jonathan Bales from Fantasy Labs, who gives like Confucius-like encouragement without the nuts and bolts details needed to make things happen. So, for example, Captain Jack has like an hour-long seminar, how to work smarter, not harder. And he breaks it down into 5 points, which are the following. Look ahead, automate, shorten the game, teamwork, and number 5, outsource. So basically he's saying, look ahead, obviously look when the line's open, automate, get a Don Best subscription, shorten the game, bet halves, quarters, bet derivative markets, teamwork, find a betting partner, and outsource, pay somebody to do your work for you. And I feel like all of that is just asking for a whole lot of trouble for any beginning sports bettor. You've got to work hard. You've got to be able to do it on your own. You've got to believe in your ability to correctly handicap a situation. If I in a hypothetical, theoretical world, if I'm the world's best CFL handicapper, which I'm not, but if I was, and then I found another person that is a very good Aussie rules handicapper, do we switch Do we share our info with each other? I'm putting my trust in that other person, whomever that is, that they're working as hard as I am at my craft as they are at their craft. Now, in the grand scheme of things, there might be some people who are actually working harder than me, and the other side of the coin is they're not working as hard as me. You don't know. It's really hard to trust somebody else. It's hard to find good help. People always say that. It's such a cliche, but if you've even watched the movie Lay the Favorite, where Dink gives money, $40,000 to a runner to place a bet, and they try to use it to place their own bet, and they lose the money, and he's like not even mad. It's like he expects that to happen. That's how crazy the sports betting world is. So I'm like, I've been doing my live stream for almost 2 years. I'm like, you have to learn from mistakes. You have to learn with your own money. Even if you're only betting $3 a game, you feel the weight of making that decision by putting money on it. And it helps you manage your bankroll. It helps you develop a process that is going to be rewarding in the long run. And Captain Jack is doing some good things with his content, but I feel like that clickbaity stuff is really just a waste of time. And he's very good. Like, his videos are very well put together for that YouTube style, but a lot of it is a waste of time, I think. He does do useful stuff like calculating hold percentages, but you can find that at a lot of different places and nothing groundbreaking there. So now I'm going to talk about Spanky, and Spanky's a whole different ball of wax. I have to admit, before I go any further, that I've never listened to Spanky's podcast, and the only reason I don't is because I know it'll be a complete waste of time. So here are the two things I have to say about Spanky. Number one is Spanky loves him some Spanky. Dude loves to talk about himself. That kind of makes me not like him at all. However, people I respect in the industry say that he's a really nice guy in person, so I'm going to say that he probably is. However, number two, Spanky to me, is not really a sports bettor at all. He places sports bets, and he makes money placing sports bets. But Spanky's mission is to not have a position on a game. And that's different from a sports bettor, a sports handicapper. Spanky's an arbor or a scalper of lines. He created software which allows him to track sports betting lines around the world, and so he can perform his arbitrage. This is why he needs, quote, air quotes again, betting partners, also known as beards, who perform the actual betting for him. So because of that, I'll never listen to his handicapping advice, because that's not his game at all. His game is to attack the market early, place a lot of small bets, and then get out of the position as the game gets closer to the start time, lock in a profit, and sit back and collect his guaranteed money. So, what the article talks about Spanky, and there's an article on the Ringer about Spanky where he talks about placing bets and beating the closing line. He doesn't say anything about locking in a profit and betting the other side of the game at any point. So what I want to do is pose a theoretical question to all three of these guys, Rufus, Captain Jack, and Spanky. If I went up to them and I said, you have no limits at the sports book. You can bet whatever amount you want at the sports book on any game. The only exception is you can only bet the game 7 minutes before it starts. I'm pretty sure that both Rufus and Captain Jack would take advantage of that, and they would be very selective and only bet large amounts of money when they were very confident that a line was not sharp. And, their bets would be few and far between, but they would throw down large amounts on some games. But if you offered that same scenario to Spanky, I don't think he would take it. Spanky would likely say no thanks and just complain about not being able to get down earlier, because his goal is not to have a position on the game. His goal is to get the line early before it moves and then get the line later after it moves and take the guaranteed profit and not eliminate as much risk as possible. And again, nothing wrong with that, but obviously sports books are not going to allow him to bet into their early lines very much, if at all. So there's a media component to all this where these people are trying to become personalities for whatever reason. And I don't consider myself a personality. I'm a podcaster. That's about it. I go to work at my job. When this thing is over, I'll place some bets next week when sports come back, but I'm not, I give opinions, I give advice, I say what I think about the industry, but I'm not a personality. I'm not a media entity, a brand that these guys are trying to make themselves out to be. And it is what it is. They obviously have good PR agents. They like to puff each other up. When they have each other on podcasts, they always say great things about the other and whatnot. So maybe they're all one big friend, one big group of super friends, I should say. But let's move on. And we have another podcast to talk about, and it's called Establish the Run. And Adam Levitan from Fantasy Labs, formerly of, the Three Donkeys podcast, I guess, started this site, Establish the Run, with others, and has Rufus Peabody on to discuss sports betting and DFS in an episode. Now, if you want to hear this episode, and I recommend that you listen to it, there's a link on Rufus's Twitter timeline. So the podcast is called Establish the Run, and Rufus is on a recent episode last week of May. Adam, of course, asked Rufus about his third-place finish at the DraftKings Sports Betting Championship. And for those of you not familiar with that weekend event, Rufus was winning technically, and because he did not get his 1 p.m. NFL bet on Sunday graded in time, he couldn't place a bet on the 4 p.m. game, and therefore he ended up finishing third instead of first. Without rehashing all of that, what was interesting is he asked Rufus if he would participate again in another sports betting championship, and Rufus said he wouldn't attend again because he realized that bettors were teaming up to form syndicates and coordinating their wagers. And he only realized this because he was privately asked to join a syndicate. So he basically goes on the podcast and says, well, I'm not going to do it again because I realized that people are entering, and they're coordinating their bets so that one of them comes out with the perfect possible outcome of a series of wagers. And I only know this because somebody asked me to join their syndicate. And I find this kind of mildly amusing because Rufus's betting career, he got his feet wet at Las Vegas Sports Consultants, but his actual betting career took off when he was launched as a free roll from a betting syndicate. So his betting career got launched by a betting syndicate that gave him free roll. And he doesn't want to be part of a syndicate in a contest. So I also chuckled at Adam Levitan stating that as a DFS pro, he can only play the head-to-head games that were $5 and up. So he was frozen out of the games that were less than $5. Like that, all that milk money was going to kill his ROI. Now, he may be a super successful DFS player. I don't know. But I find if less than $5 games are important to your survival in DFS, that industry cannot be on its, has to be on its last legs. We shall see, we shall see. Now, I realize Rufus was the guest on this podcast, but I would have loved to hear him ask about syndicates in DFS, which, if you've listened to this podcast, you know all about people, developing syndicates to take over the lobbies of the DFS sites. And the larger syndicates pretty much propped up the whole industry through its weak years where it almost died after the Ethan scandal. Regardless, like I said before, this podcast was very interesting, and I think it's worth your time if you want to listen to it. So check that out, and good luck to them and their website. I certainly wouldn't pay for that information, but to each their own. So we've got this month Aussie rules and NASCAR, and then we'll have NHL pretty soon, and I'm looking forward to seeing the series prices on the NHL. And there's going to be a team that's going to have one of their better players either test positive for COVID or maybe have a minor injury, and they're going to try to push the start back so they can get their players back. It's just a matter of which team it's going to be. I have no idea, but I don't expect the hockey to start till near the end of July. But if they're smart, they'll start before the NBA starts, because it's definitely going to help their viewership going forward, because people are just starved for sports that matter right now. So before I go, I just want to say my live stream will start this next Friday, June 12th, on FingerLakes1.com. You can also watch the Finger Lakes 1 channel on YouTube. And my live stream is called Sportsbook Confidential. You can check out the Twitter page. It's at Sports Confident. No spaces or anything there. And I do a half an hour live every Friday morning, and try to keep you up on that weekend's events, and try to give you a little sports betting lesson, some useful information, and book reviews and things like that. So excited to be back. Hopefully I'll have some real interesting topics for you, and maybe some futures on the NHL playoffs if I can find some odds. So looking forward to returning, and that's going to do it for this episode. I want to thank you very much for listening, for you guys for sticking with me for all this time, and we'll get back to betting regularly very soon, and getting back to complain about poor coaching and whatnot. So please take care of yourselves. Do what you need to do to survive. I wish everybody the best, no matter what I say on this podcast. I might say some not nice things to people, but I certainly don't wish any hardship with you or your families or your health. I hope everybody has a safe rest of 2020, and that's going to do it. So we'll see you next month, and I just want to say take care, everybody, and let's win some bets, okay? See you later.